This man stepped on this floating slab of ice deep in the Pacific Ocean with a mission. He and his filming companion planned to shoot a thrilling adventure documentary about ocean inhabitants, but he got much more than he bargained for when this orca popped up, because the giant sea mammal did something totally unexpected. Ben was looking forward to this day on the ocean. He and his filming buddy George rented a boat and set out to sea with a broad smile. They would capture nature's most beautiful aquatic creatures on camera and use the footage in their documentary. But this episode was about to get a shocking twist. The two men arrived at their first stop of the day, a floating piece of ice mass in the middle of the ocean. The mass was shaped in a moon-like half-circle, forming a calm water pond at its inner curve. Ben exited the boat and climbed on the ice while George readied his camera. It was thrilling for both of them since they were new at this, so results weren't guaranteed. But the two friends were about to get a huge surprise. Ben took a seat on the icy rock and spoke about the aquatic creatures in this area, mostly talking about the orca sightings. Then George spotted something. George filmed from his boat, which was about 20 feet away from where Ben was sitting. His camera focused in on his talking buddy, but after a few minutes, it also spotted something else. There was movement in the water near Ben's feet. It started slowly, but that didn't last long. Ben had no clue of what was going on beneath his feet, and even George was not initially dialed in on the occurrence below the water's surface. But when the curious cameraman finally noticed the water moving and warned his friend, it was already too late. "Ben, look out below!" Before Ben could react, a giant 7,000-pound orca burst out of the water before him. She didn't jump over Ben, as you see in the movies, but the enormous mammal did fill up the entire gap between the two friends. This was insane, and it was about to get even more crazy. Ben was in shock, so much so that he even forgot how to speak in full sentences. The man just shouted and mumbled random words. The footage was priceless, and George knew this, so he kept the camera rolling the entire time. They were, however, very much on guard because this was a delicate situation. Footage from an orca up close was extremely rare, so they wanted to capture as much as possible. After the initial shot of adrenaline calmed down a bit, Ben tried to move as slowly as possible so he wouldn't spook the orca, not knowing that the animal would soon cause massive panic. The brave adventurer used calm and softly spoken words to communicate with the large sea-bound creature, hoping to get a positive reaction from her. But the orca didn't respond to his callings. Instead, both men saw a change in behavior coming from the orca, one that was far less desired. The large orca became restless out of nowhere and dove under the water's surface multiple times, reappearing just moments later again and again. And every time she did, the orca would pound her massive body against the floating piece of ice. Her approach appeared aggressive, and it made Ben lose his balance. "What's happening?" George watched in horror as he witnessed the situation from their boat. Ben, on the other hand, was less lucky. Every time he tried to get up, the orca would slam the ground beneath him, making him lose footing. But after the last pounding, it stayed away a little longer, and Ben took his chance. With George chanting him on from the boat, Ben panicked, got up, and ran across the icy bridge. He thought he was going to make it, but the large aquatic animal had other plans. Just 5 feet before Ben could reach the outstretched arms of his friend, the orca cut him off. The animal pounded the ice with full force, breaking the ice path in half and severing its connection with the boat. The leftover piece of icy rubble floated further and further away from the safety of the boat, and George watched helplessly at his friend, who was still on there. "I can't jump this cap." Ben nervously crawled along the edges of his floating ice ridge, looking for any sign of the animal. The only way he could save his life was if George would hover the boat closer so he could make the jump. He gave his buddy the proper instructions and readied himself. But then, fate intervened, and not in a good way. The orca wasn't done with Ben, not by a long shot, and he was about to prove it. As George started the boat's engine, a loud rumble was heard. It came from deep within the water, and both men knew this sound all too well. It was the sound water made when something large moved through it with high speed. creating a negative pressure beneath the surface. Normally, this would occur when heavy boats moved through the water. But both Ben and George knew what caused this pressure vortex. It was the orca that hunted them. The large animal moved beneath the ice bridge with high speed and was about to show its head again for her final act. George shouted for Ben to jump, but before he had the chance to, the animal pounded to ice beneath Ben's feet, launching him into the water as a result. George shouted in horror as he witnessed his best friend disappear beneath the ice-cold water's surface. Panic arose within him, and he moved quickly toward every corner of his boat, hoping to catch a glimpse of his friend Ben. But to his disappointment, the poor man was nowhere to be found. George fell to his knees and started crying, thinking he'd lost his friend forever. Everyone knows that these kinds of whales could be extremely dangerous, so seeing a friendly one up close was too good to be true. Ben made one last desperate attempt to look for his friend deep down. He hung his whole upper body overboard and gazed into the ocean blue. While George searched from his position above water, an entirely different struggle was going on beneath the surface. The pressure vortex, created by the orca, was sucking Ben down deeper and deeper without him being able to resist. When the water pressure finally neutralized, Ben was already well over 50 feet deep. He could feel the intense pressure building on his eardrums. But that was not his biggest worry, because in the distance, Ben saw that the giant orca had turned around and was swimming straight toward him. The animal was moving at high speed. Ben could tell as he held his breath, literally and figuratively. They didn't call these animals killer whales for no reason. Ben knew this going in, but he never figured he would be in the ice-cold water with one. The poor man feared for his life. Ben frantically moved his feet, trying to reach the water's surface in time, but the orca was simply too fast, and Ben realized that. He thought that his last seconds on this beautiful earth were near, and the once brave adventurer now made a final scared prayer. This is it. While Ben counted down the moments before impact with the large orca, George was still searching from the safety of his boat. There was some development in the water since many bubbles had come up over the last few seconds. There was clearly a lot of movement going on down there. And then the unthinkable happened. Out of nowhere, Ben's head popped up above the water, making George fall backward out of initial fright. George's best friend was gasping for air as he reached for the boat. "Are you all right, man?" George spoke as he reached out his hand to help. Ben was lifted out of the water, and even though he was still catching most of his breath, he could speak. He said he was fine, and told George that even though it seemed that the orca was trying to attack him, it did something else, something much stranger. "What did it do?" George asked. Ben smiled, mostly because he was glad to still be alive, but also because he was smart enough to wear a waterproof body camera for this documentary. He unbuckled the device from his torso and rewound the tape to the moment of his plummet into the water. George watched eagerly. The two men were glued to the screen, and after a hazy first minute of Ben struggling to fight the water pressure, the footage stabilized. There was just endless amounts of ocean blue around Ben at first, and then the orca appeared on screen. It swam toward Ben at high speed, but then, right before the orca reached Ben, it made an insanely sharp U-turn and regathered some distance. From her new position, the orca started making bizarre flips underwater. It also screeched loudly and unnaturally while moving her fin around in rapid motion. "This is remarkable!" George spoke with excitement in his voice. But the two men did not realize that the orca that fascinated and scared them both was closer than they thought. As Ben and George gazed at the monitor in their hands, the orca suddenly jumped out of the water before them. It flapped its fin and gave the same unnatural screech. At that moment, something clicked in Ben's mind. Was this creature trying to tell them something? Was it persuading them to follow her? Ben made his thoughts clear to George, and even though he was hesitant, they still decided it was worth checking out. They started the engine, and the two men sailed up to the location of the orca in the water. It quickly became clear that Ben's thoughts were correct, because the demeanor of the orca instantly shifted to cheerful when the two men sailed closer. The orca started swimming east in a straight line because this animal had a secret mission, and it needed Ben's and George's help to finish it. It swam straight to her goal. While she did, she screeched multiple times, looking back occasionally to see if the men were still following. After about 10 minutes, the Orca reached her destination, and what they found there shocked them. "Something is floating in the water!" Ben shouted. The two men raised the boat's power and sailed past the Orca for the first time. The animal patiently waited while letting out a screech that sounded sad this time. Ben and George reached for a large floating piece of metal plate, but then they looked closer. Fingers were gripping the edge of this floating object. "There is someone in the water, hanging on for dear life," George said to his friend frantically. The two men wasted no time and rushed over to the location of the hands and started pulling. Moments later, a weak but alive man surfaced. Ben and George pulled harder and eventually lifted the man onto the dry sanctuary of their boat. Ben grabbed a blanket from an emergency kit they had on board and started rubbing the man's back for warmth. The man had little strength, but eventually he regained contagiousness and managed to speak. "What happened to you?" George asked the poor man. The man looked up and started to explain. He said his name was Lucas Finley, and he was part of a research team that studied climate change and its effects on ice mass in these parts of the Pacific. But the fate struck. Their boat was hit by the one thing they were investigating, the one thing they tried to prevent. Because of global warming, the larger ice mass melted, and a large piece broke off while their ship was sailing beneath it. We heard a loud crack, but before we knew it, it was already too late. The massive chart of ice broke off from its main body and crashed down on top of their ship. The impact was so heavy that it broke their ship clean in half, making it sink almost instantly. The devastation was tremendous, and panic was all around. The scientists started weeping softly. Ben tried to calm him down a bit while continuously rubbing the blanket, but the men's emotions got the better of him. Lucas stated that he just managed to save himself during the commotion. He was able to hold on to that floating metal part, but his friends and colleagues were most likely lost. The man was heartbroken. "These people are not just your everyday colleagues. We just spent almost 4 years of our lives together, collecting data and doing everything as a team. We eat together, we sleep together, and now they're all gone." Lucas put his hands to his face and cried. The poor scientist was clearly already mourning the loss of his friends. But there wasn't much time to be sad because the Orca that led Ben and George there had other plans. The animal let out a loud and odd screech again, indicating that he wanted the men to follow her, and this time the man wasted no time. There was a third act to this story, and the helpful Orca led them straight to it. George got behind the wheel and eagerly followed the large sea creature. The last time they trusted her, they found Lucas, so who knows what she will conjure this time. The Orca swam around the massive ice mass. It was a nervous trip because the same fate would come to Ben, George, and Lucas if a shard broke off again. After a short trip, they managed to turn the corner and make it to the other side of the mass. That's when they found it. George saw it first, and even though he had a rough idea of what he saw, he needed the distressed scientist's opinion to prove it. He placed his hand on the man's shoulder and pointed toward a gap in the ice mass. Lucas looked up and started to scream instantly. "Oh my God!" His 4 co-workers and friends were all still alive, and they were residing in a tall but narrow crack within the ice mass. "Wonders have not left this world," the man shouted happily. He almost jumped back into the water to reach them faster, but luckily enough, Ben managed to stop him. "I thought you were all gone from this world." But luckily, that wasn't the case. They were all alive and well. The waves that arose after the crash drifted them to the other side of the ice mass, and together they climbed into the crack, where they remained. But this could have gone much worse, and that would have definitely happened if not for the help of this amazing sea creature. The Orca was the hero of the day. She witnessed the distressed people and set out to find help. After all the people were on board, they sailed to shore, where the scientist got proper medical treatment. 6 months later, Ben and George's documentary dropped. George's camera managed to capture almost every part of that day, and the footage was a testament to the beauty of the sea, with the Orca, who they called B, at the heart of it. It's a place we need to protect at any cost.